Mail Story 1. So, I was in Beijing, walking down a side street just off Wangfujing, one of those alleys that starts bustling and tight but then widens into some sort of open plaza where people gather for all kinds of reasons. It was a mix of market stalls, cafes, and random old men selling fake watches off a cardboard box. I found a tiny, rickety cafe that had a few seats facing the street and decided to take a break. I got my tea and settled in, watching the chaotic flow of life pass by. Scooters zipped in and out like they owned the place. People weaved through the crowd like fish through water, and street vendors shouted prices for roasted chestnuts and skewered meat. Everything was loud, messy, and alive. Then, out of nowhere, a dull crunch echoed through the air. Heads snapped in the direction of the noise. A car had just clipped a cyclist, sending the guy on the bike tumbling into a pile of plastic crates. It wasn't a hard hit, but it was enough to make everyone stop and gawk. The cyclist, to his credit, popped back up, dusting himself off while the car driver scrambled out, probably to apologize or negotiate or whatever the norm is in these situations. But that's when things got weird. The crowd around the scene had grown thick, people moving in like a wave, closing off the street. They surrounded the driver, hands gripping his arms. Meanwhile, the cyclist, with this casualness that was almost theatrical, walked right past the driver, who was now being held in place. The guy strolled over to the car, opened the door like he was picking up his own groceries, and slid into the driver's seat. No hesitation. He revved the engine, lurched forward, and somehow maneuvered the car so the front wheel rolled over the driver's foot. The sound was sickening, like stepping on a bag of gravel. But nobody did a damn thing. The crowd just watched. The cyclist, now in control of the car, stepped out, adjusted his shirt collar like he'd just finished a day at the office, and gave the crowd a quick nod of gratitude. He grabbed his bike, which somehow still worked despite the crash, and pedaled off into the madness of Beijing traffic like he had an appointment to keep. Meanwhile, the poor driver, now hobbling on one leg, got released by the crowd. He cursed under his breath, gingerly got back into his car, and drove off, barely managing to avoid clipping another pedestrian in his hurry. The entire thing was over in what felt like seconds. People turned away, conversation picked back up, and the vendors resumed hawking their goods like nothing happened. I finished my tea, watching the spot where it all went down. It was like a street performance, a one-act play that the city had seen 1,000 times. Mail Story 2, it was one of my first days in China, and I hopped on a bus without thinking much. I was still jet-lagged, mind swirling with street signs and characters I couldn't read, and surrounded by a flood of people who knew exactly where they were going. I found a spot near the back, squeezed between a man balancing a sack of vegetables and a young couple lost in their own little world. The bus smelled like a mix of street food, sweat, and something tangy I couldn't quite place. The bus jolted forward, and we trundled down one of those gentle slopes that dot the city. I adjusted my stance, bracing for the jerky stop-start rhythm of Shanghai traffic. That's when I felt it. Warm liquid seeping around my sneakers. For a split second, my mind raced through possibilities. Leaking groceries? Spilled drink? But then I caught sight of the culprit, a tiny kid crouched in the aisle, wearing these odd little pants with a big slit right where you'd expect a diaper, except there was no diaper. The kid's mom, standing a few feet away, didn't blink. She just waited, holding on to the rail like it was any other Tuesday. I could hear the soft trickle hitting the floor, spreading toward my feet. Everyone else, packed shoulder to shoulder, didn't even flinch. A few people stepped over the growing puddle, like it was a pothole on a rainy day. I tried shifting away without stepping on anyone's toes, but there wasn't much room to maneuver. The liquid was already soaking into the grooves of the floor mats. A grizzled old man next to me let out a heavy sigh, shook his head, and took another sip from a bottle wrapped in a paper bag. For a second, I thought he might say something, but he just stared out the window, like this was all par for the course. The bus kept rattling on. The kid finished his business, and his mom calmly scooped him up. The driver never missed a beat, just swerved around a motorbike and kept barreling forward. I got off at the next stop, shoes squelching with every step, and found a hose at a car wash down the street to rinse off. As I watched the water swirl away, I couldn't help but laugh. Made story 3, I had this day off in Shanghai, and someone recommended I visit this temple just outside the city. Figured I'd soak in some culture and peace, right? Wrong. After chugging down one too many bottles of that sugary iced tea they love over there, my bladder was ready to burst, so I made a beeline for the nearest toilet block on the temple grounds. Oh, the moment I stepped in, my nose recoiled. That stench hit like a freight train, rank, sour, the kind that sticks to your throat. The floor glistened with this thin film of murky water, and every step came with that sickening squelch. I'd been around Asia long enough to get used to squat toilets, but this was on another level. No stalls, no privacy, just a row of squat holes cut into grimy tiles, 6, maybe 8 of them, side by side, like an open-air shitting contest. I hesitated, glancing around, hoping for a roll of toilet paper or at least a hose, but of course, nothing. You're on your own in these parts. That's when I noticed the guys. 2 of them squatting over the pits, pants around their ankles, like it was the most casual thing in the world. One had a newspaper spread open, flipping through the pages like he was lounging in his living room. The other guy? He was taking a dump, full-on grunting, while chatting up a couple of buddies standing right in front of him. These guys were just hanging out, puffing on cigarettes, not even flinching at the scene or the smell. I shuffled forward, trying not to step in whatever the hell that liquid on the ground was. The dude squatting was mid-conversation, letting out the kind of sounds you never want to hear in public. And here I was, this awkward foreigner, standing there with my bladder ready to burst, surrounded by a bizarre tableau of shitting and smoking. I was the only thing out of place in that entire scene. They barely gave me a glance, just kept up their banter like it was another day at the office. Meanwhile, I'm desperately trying to focus on not slipping or stepping in whatever was slowly pooling around my shoes. In the end, I just couldn't do it. I turned around and walked out, holding it in till I found a convenience store down the road. Mail story 4. I had just arrived in Zigong after a grueling bus ride, bags heavy on my shoulders, ready to collapse at the hotel. I hailed the first taxi I saw outside the station, eager to be done with the day. The cab driver, a grizzled guy with a cigarette dangling from his lips, waved me in with a bored flick of his hand. I barely settled into the back seat before he yanked the door shut and hit the gas. We'd barely gone 2 blocks when he suddenly pulled over. I thought, maybe a quick pit stop? But then, without a word, he popped open the passenger door and a uniformed policeman slid in like he'd been waiting for this exact ride. No introductions, no questions. The taxi rolled back into traffic, now with a cop riding shotgun. The air in the cab thickened with cigarette smoke as the 2 of them launched into this rapid-fire conversation. My Mandarin's decent, so it didn't take long to piece together what they were talking about. The driver had a buddy who'd gotten himself locked up for something vague. Drunk and disorderly, or maybe a fight? The cop, slouched in the front seat with one foot propped on the dash, started rattling off numbers. The cost of freedom, apparently, came with a price tag. The driver grunted in response, eyes locked on the road, only half paying attention as he maneuvered around scooters and buses. The cop punched a number into his phone, calling up his superior, right there in the front seat. The conversation turned into haggling, like they were trying to score a deal at a night market. 50,000 yuan, then down to 40 if they could get the paperwork lost by the weekend. I leaned back, trying to keep my expression blank. Ethnically Chinese, sure, but I'm a foreigner by upbringing. Still, they didn't even glance back. To them, I was just part of the scenery, like another billboard flashing past. They kept going, negotiating the finer details of the bribe like they were ordering lunch. The cop even joked about his cut, the driver chuckling between puffs. 10 minutes later, the cop hopped out at an intersection, waving the driver off like he'd just finished a casual chat with an old friend. The taxi driver didn't miss a beat, floors it, and 10 minutes later, I'm dropped off at my hotel. I paid the fare, still half in disbelief, as he peeled away into the crowded streets, off to God knows what next deal. Mail Story 5. I wandered into People's Park in Shanghai, expecting a peaceful stroll, maybe a quick escape from the relentless city noise. But the moment I turned a corner, it hit me like a wave. The park was buzzing, not with laughter or music, but with a strange energy, like the hum of a beehive. There were people everywhere, mostly older folks, hung on strings like they were browsing for groceries. At first, I couldn't wrap my head around it. Flyers, laminated sheets, even some colorful handwritten notes. It all looked like some kind of makeshift marketplace. But instead of products or produce, every single flyer had photos of people on them. Young men and women, stiffly smiling in posed photos with neat little blocks of text underneath. Age, height, income, even hometown. No prices, though. Just stats like they were cars at a dealership. An older man stepped back to make way, nodding to me like I was just another shopper passing by. That's when it clicked. It was like a stock exchange, but instead of trading shares, they were trading futures, marriage futures. I watched as these elderly parents haggled, debated, waved their hands animatedly over their children's qualifications, trying to score the best deal. I guess it was love by proxy, minus the romance. The urgency in their eyes was unnerving. One woman, clutching a plastic umbrella, glanced at me and gestured toward one of the flyers. I leaned closer. Her son, apparently, was a software engineer, born in 1986, tall and handsome, according to her scrawled note. She beamed proudly, like she had all the time in the world to explain his virtues, but I just nodded awkwardly and backed away. Further down, I saw a man scrutinizing two flyers side by side, muttering to himself. He was probably trying to decide which potential daughter-in-law had the better credentials. There were even a few serious-looking parents exchanging phone numbers, like they were closing some kind of business deal. The whole scene felt surreal. The hum of their chatter, the intensity in their eyes, it was a whole ecosystem of desperation and hope. I couldn't help but feel like I'd walked into some parallel world where romance didn't stand a chance against the relentless march of practicality. I left that park, the sound of shuffling papers and murmuring voices lingering behind me, a strange taste in my mouth, like I'd been chewing on the secrets of strangers. Mail Story 6. I was staying with a wealthy family in China, and at one point, I casually mentioned that I liked skiing back home. Big mistake. They got excited and decided they'd take me skiing. Turns out their idea of skiing and mine were miles apart. We packed into a shiny SUV and drove a few hours out of the city to some place they were calling a ski resort. I was expecting something like Aspen or even a small mountain like we have back home. But no, what I got was, I don't even know how to describe it. The place looked like it was designed by someone who had only ever heard about skiing through vague descriptions. The resort was a flat piece of land with artificial snow dusted over it, like a thin layer of powdered sugar. There was a confusing mess of signs, ropes, and mismatched rental gear scattered everywhere. It was chaos. The strangest part was how they had set up the slopes. They built it so that everyone, no matter their skill level, had to pass through the bunny hill first. I'm talking about experienced skiers mixed with absolute beginners, all funneled into a single narrow slope with a magic carpet ride that crawled slower than an old man crossing the street. Above that, there was a rope tow, and above that, there was an advanced slope, but you had to fight through the sea of people just to get there. People were tripping, falling, and getting tangled in each other's skis. It was like someone had dumped a kindergarten class onto the snow with no instructions. I saw a guy trying to ride the rope tow but kept slipping, dragging 4 other people with him, like a messed up game of human dominoes. By the time I got to the terrain park, I was expecting it to be a joke, and it did not disappoint. The moguls were more like snow boulders. I swear, one of them was as tall as my waist, like a snowman made by someone with anger issues. The jumps were jagged, and one looked like it had just collapsed in on itself. And then, in the middle of it all, a toddler was climbing up one of the ramps. His mother, dressed to the nines in high heels, stood at the bottom, shouting something encouraging, completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a ski slope. I tried one of the runs but gave up after nearly crashing into a family who had decided to take a lunch break right in the middle of the hill. After that, I headed straight back to the lodge, where I found solace in a questionable cup of hot chocolate and watched the chaos unfold from a distance. It was the weirdest skiing experience I've ever had, but at least it made for one hell of a story. Mail Story 7. We were on this trip in China, right before the Beijing Olympics. The whole country was buzzing, prepping for the games, and there I was, a 6'-tall black dude in the middle of it all. Our guide, a chipper woman who could talk a mile a minute, told us that seeing black people around here was about as rare as finding a unicorn. I shrugged it off, didn't think much of it, but it turned out to be a much bigger deal than I expected. That day, we headed to the Great Wall. I threw on my American football jersey, figuring it was a good day to rep my team, while we trekked up those ancient steps. The thing about the Great Wall? It's a hell of a workout. Forget all those postcard perfect shots of people gracefully strolling along. Those steep sections will have your calves burning and lungs gasping in no time. But I was determined to see as much as I could, jersey and all. The moment we got up there, I noticed people staring. Not the usual curious glances you get as a tourist, but full-on gawking, jaws slightly open. I brushed it off and kept moving, thinking they were just fascinated by the whole foreigner thing. Then it started. One by one, people began to approach me, gesturing with their phones. At first, I thought they were asking me to take photos of them. But nope, they wanted photos with me. In seconds, it snowballed. People came out of nowhere, swarming around, pulling out their phones. They were grinning like they'd just won the lottery. I had no clue what was going on, but I figured, hell, I'm already here. Why not just go with it? So I threw on the biggest smile I could muster, posing like some celebrity. There was this one older lady who practically shoved her kid into my arms for a photo, and the poor kid looked as confused as I felt. Next thing I knew, they were asking for autographs. I hadn't signed anything since high school yearbooks, but here I was, scribbling my name on hats, maps, and even the back of someone's notebook. It felt like I was at some bizarre fan convention. It got out of hand fast. The crowd ballooned until it clogged up the entire stretch of the wall where we were. People were yelling, waving their hands, shoving each other just to get a closer look. Eventually, some security guy in a bright red jacket showed up, gesturing frantically for me to move along. I got shuffled away like I was causing some kind of diplomatic incident. Few weeks later, flying into Shanghai, it happened again. This time, I was just trying to get through the airport, wearing my shades and a backpack. I noticed people pointing, whispering, and before I knew it, a few of them straight up decided I was Kanye West. I guess to some of them, tall black guy in sunglasses equaled Kanye. They didn't seem to care that I was missing the entourage, the bling, or, the millions of dollars. I just kept walking, chuckling to myself. China, man. That place was wild. Mail Story 8. Back in Nanjing, I was stuck managing IT for this college, which sounded better on paper than it turned out. My boss, Mr. Zhang, short, stocky, always with this slicked back hair that shone like he'd bathed in motor oil, was the supposed head of technology. The only tech skill he had was how to keep a ping pong ball spinning on his paddle for 5 minutes straight. Guy couldn't even tell a router from a toaster. The thing is, he didn't need to. The dude was untouchable. He landed that cushy position not because of some stellar IT credentials, but because he was a table tennis legend. Like, this guy had trophies stacked in his office like they were participation ribbons. That's how it works there. Be good at ping pong and they'll hand you an entire department to run, even if you can't run a networked cable without choking yourself. So, here I was, busting my ass trying to make sense of their ancient systems while Zhang pretended to supervise. He'd stroll around with his phone glued to his ear, barking orders in Mandarin, sounding important. But the reality? Every time a server went down or a computer lab crashed, he'd look at me like I was the one who'd spilled coffee on the motherboard. Then he'd mutter something about upgrading our firewall or optimizing the mainframe, like he even knew what those terms meant. The kicker was his sudden lifestyle upgrade. 1 month into me being there, Zhang showed up in a sparkling new BMW. The thing was spotless, always parked right outside his window like a trophy. He'd lean back in his chair, tapping away at his flashy new Rolex, the kind with diamonds that probably weren't cubic zirconia. Meanwhile, I was stuck riding my rusty electric scooter, weaving through traffic like my life depended on it, which honestly, it did. Word around the office was that Zhang was swimming in kickbacks, a little here, a little there, contracts, consultations, who knows what else. He had this knack for making things disappear from the budget, and then, like magic, a new watch would appear on his wrist. The college higher-ups didn't bat an eye. Hell, they were probably in on it. One time, I had to set up some new software in the faculty office, which meant navigating the hellscape of outdated PCs and dusty servers. Zhang sauntered in, eyes scanning the room like he was in a crime thriller. I knew he had no clue what I was doing, but he still insisted on hovering behind me, making weird noises like he was thinking deeply. He kept nodding like I'd just cured cancer. The man couldn't open a PDF, but there he was, taking credit every time something worked. By the end of my stint, the only thing I learned was how to smile and nod whenever Zhang launched into one of his self-congratulatory speeches. The guy had the whole place wrapped around his finger, and that BMW kept getting shinier.